The 2,000-yard club is one of the most prestigious clubs in the NFL. The difficulty involved with this task makes it truly stand out as a serious accomplishment, and only 8 players have ever made it there. 1973, O.J. Simpson, 1984, Eric Dickerson, 1997, Barry Sanders, 1998, Terrell Davis, 2003, Jamal Lewis, 2009, Chris Johnson, 2012, Adrian Peterson, and 2020, Derrick Henry. All 8 of these seasons are incredible, but today I want to rank all 8 of these seasons against each other and truly find out which one stands above them all. It was a lot harder than I thought it would be initially, but I am excited to give you my list and we can all figure out together which season is the best of them all. I am excited to get into it. I'm going to be ranking each player's season from 8 to 1, starting at 8, and I'm going to be taking into consideration criteria such as yards, the amount of carries, the amount of touchdowns on the ground and in the air, yards per attempt, receiving stats, wins, their usage rate, their yards per game, their playoff stats. That's a big part of it to me, is if you really, brought your team to a winning level. Fumbles and turnovers, and honestly, overall, what they meant to their team. So, without further ado, please do like and subscribe if you enjoy. This video took a ton of time to get the research done for. I had to delve into the depths of statistical analysis and watch film and understand what these players meant to their teams, and it took a lot of time. I'll also tell you, it was not fun to edit at all. Please like and subscribe. This took hours on end to get this edited and ready to go, and I would really appreciate it, especially if you enjoy the video. Just like and subscribe, man. Thank you. Without further ado, let's get into it. So, number 8 on this list, it might come as a surprise to some of you, especially when there are players like Jamal Lewis and Chris Johnson who didn't necessarily have NFL Hall of Fame level careers at any capacity. But I'm going to have to give the 8th spot on this list to Barry Sanders. Had a hell of a season. 2,053 yards. He did that on 335 rushes. That is the second lowest on this list, which is very impressive in its own right. Plus, he added 33 receptions for 305 yards in the air. That doesn't sound like a lot. It really, honestly, isn't, but in comparison to some of these other players, it is. He had the second most receiving yards out of anybody on this list. That is where he stands out. Out of all of the categories, he stands out, and the lowest rushes, besides one player, but that one player, there's a little bit of an outlier, and then he also had a good amount of receiving yards. Overall, though, his season wasn't too special. The Lions didn't do much. They did not make any noise whatsoever. It's the Lions franchise. What can you expect? He ran for 11 touchdowns, which is the lowest on this entire list. That is not good. The fact that you have 2,053 yards is great and it's impressive, but to only have 11 scores on that and he did have 3 receiving touchdowns, but in comparison to others, even with those 3 receiving touchdowns, he still had less running touchdowns than almost everybody on the list, even if you add those 3 touchdowns in the air. So, overall, Barry's season was pretty unimpressive in comparison to these other guys. 7, 6, 5 were all better, and I'll tell you why. Before I do, I gotta explain that Barry was an animal, and honestly, I think he's probably a top 3 running back of all time. He was so good at what he did, and he accomplished it at a pace that is unmatched. The way he ran, he was so versatile, so agile, such a great player. But overall, this season disappoints in the statistical region. He didn't get a ton of wins, and when you can't win, it's hard to put you too high on this list. There are other guys on this list that, they won Super Bowls, and Barry Sanders couldn't do that, and yeah, it's hard to do that from a running back position, but overall, 2,053 yards with not a ton of touchdowns to back it up. Final factor for Barry Sanders' very low ranking on this list is the fact that he had 2 seriously dud games. Both games under 34 yards, and that's unacceptable to me. To be great on this list, you have to consistently run for, 60, 70, 100, 150 yards a game. Barry didn't do that with these 2 dud games. It hurt his overall consistency, and it definitely hurt his ranking on this list. He did have a low amount of fumbles. He only had 3 fumbles the entire season, which is a good stat to have, but there are other guys in this list that had just as many as he did. So that is why Barry is in the 8th spot. The number 7 spot was pretty hard to narrow down. There are a few people on this list that I thought, they were fighting for that 7th spot. But overall, I'm going to have to give the 7th spot to 2003 Jamal Lewis. His 2003 season was by far the best of his career, and it does seem to stand the test of time now that I'm looking back at it. He had a very bad amount of carries. He ran for 387 carries. That is the 14th in NFL history. And when you have that amount of carries, it really hurts your performance on this list, because that just makes it a lot easier for you to hit that 2,000 mark. And hitting that 2,000 mark is what this club is about. It's one of the most important factors for this list, for me personally. That 387 carries is crazy, and overall, that's a big part of why he's at 7. There is somebody really high on this list that had a ton of carries, but what they accomplished was unmatched, and I will completely explain why they are high and Jamal isn't when I get to them. But Jamal ran it for 387 times, 14th most in NFL history. He had a pretty average 2,000-yard season for the most part. He had 2,066 yards, 14 touchdowns is pretty average, 5.3 yards per attempt, which is very below average, actually. It's the second worst on this list. He also had an extremely poor performance in the playoffs versus the Titans, which hurts him tremendously. He ran for 35 yards on 14 attempts, and if you can't get it done on the brightest stage, where can you? And that sucks, because he had a crazy game in the season. He had 295 yards in one game on 30 carries in a regular season game. He couldn't do it in the playoffs. And the fact that, he ran it the 14th most times in NFL history. Every other category statistically was average. He didn't really add to this team from a winning perspective. I mean, he obviously helped. He was a big part of their offense, but their defense is kind of what carried them. And his playoff performance was one of the worst on this list. It was incredibly sad to see. Jamal Lewis, he kind of runs like a stocky toddler. I mean, I had fun watching his film just watching him run. He looks really funny. He kind of looks like if you got Derrick Henry and you just kind of squished him a little bit. Like, Derrick Henry's 6'3". You put him in a 5'11" body, but you don't take away any of his muscle or his weight. I mean, that's Jamal Lewis. He was a tank. He was running through people. And overall, he had a pretty decent 2,000-yard season, but compared to these other guys, does not stand up to them. And that is why he makes the 7th spot. The 6th spot. This is where things start to get even more interesting, because I had a hard time putting Derrick Henry, who is on this list at 6, his 2020 campaign. I got to see it with my own eyes very recently, which helps, me do my research in comparison to these other guys. But he had an incredible season. It deserves all the praise he's been getting. Offensive Player of the Year this year. Obviously, he had a couple MVP warranted, discussions. He was in that discussion a little bit. He had 378 carries. That's a lot of carries, but 378 carries, 2,027 yards, 17 touchdowns, which is great because that is the second most on this list. Very good to see Derrick add a lot into that touchdown category. It helped his performance on this list, and it was just a really important part of his team, and that's the biggest thing for me. I didn't get to see all these guys play, and that sucks, and it's hard to list. It's hard to rank somebody that you never saw play in live, person. But I saw Derrick play, and the amount of importance he had to his team was incredible. Derrick Henry made that offense tick. He was the reason they were a good offense. Without Derrick Henry, the play action doesn't work. Ryan Tannehill, he doesn't make Ryan Tannehill
compared to a lot of other quarterbacks. I think Ryan is pretty good, but Derrick is a big reason why he's having the statistical years he's been having these past couple years. Derrick is what makes this offense run, and the Ravens in the playoffs knew that. Throughout the entire offseason, they added guys to stop the run. Calais Campbell, Brandon Allen, people that can stop the run, and they did. Derrick Henry got clamped in the playoffs. He had 40 yards on 18 carries, and again, just like Jamal Lewis, that hurts him tremendously. I can't put you any higher on this list if you can't perform in the biggest stage, and it's one thing to not even get to the stage, but there's only so much one man can do on a football field. But with that said, when it is one game and you're what makes that offense tick and you don't perform well, it's not a good sign. Derrick had a great season statistically, and he only had 3 fumbles, which is great because there's some guys higher on the list that had, a ton of fumbles. Derrick didn't add a lot in that category, and overall, his placement is mostly due to the fact that he had only 3 fumbles. He had less carries and ran for almost as many yards as Jamal Lewis. The fact that he basically was the Titans offense, and all of those factors combined put him at the 6th spot. To move on from the number 6 spot with Derrick Henry, this might be a surprise to some if you just look at the all-time rushing yards in a season. Eric Dickerson's 1984 season takes the cake. He has the most yards in a single NFL season in NFL history. Crazy cool accomplishment, and I'm sure he will stay atop that leaderboard for a long time. I don't see that being broken anytime soon. It's hard to put into words how impressive that is. 2,105 yards in a single season. Looking at that, you might think this guy deserves to be in the top 3, top 2, top 1, but no. Eric Dickerson's season was good, but it really wasn't great when you look at the guys ahead of him. That 2,105 yards is great, but it doesn't put him a mile ahead of these guys on the list. You think about it, he only had 50 more yards than, Derrick or Jamal Lewis, or even you look at Barry Sanders, who had 2,066 yards, and compare that to Eric's 2,105, it's only a 39-yard difference. And in the whole scheme of things, that isn't too big, but seeing him at the top of the leaderboard, 2,100 yards, that's a record that truly won't be broken for a long time. Eric had a pretty good amount of touchdowns. He had 14 touchdowns on the season. That's respectable. It's a good amount. In comparison with these other guys, I'd say it's average to a little above average, kind of in that Jamal Lewis territory. But the biggest knock, the reason he's not even higher on this list, he had 14 fumbles. That is a very large amount of fumbles. He had as many fumbles as he had touchdowns, and he had 14 touchdowns to 14 fumbles. Like, come on, man. I can't put you high on this list if you're not going to hold on to the ball. 14 fumbles, that's the most on this list by far. And he was a detriment to his team in the turnover category, and I'm positive that hurt them and, led to a few losses. 14 fumbles isn't just a little bit of a pinch, that isn't a little bit of a kick. That's a full-blown hurt your team, and we will lose games if you fumble 14 times in a season. His playoff game, he played pretty well. He had 100 yards and a touchdown, but he also had a fumble. And that fumble probably was a big reason they lost that game. And overall, it's impressive that he ran for 2,105 yards, all day long. But, man, I can't put him any higher. 14 fumbles, man. 14 touchdowns was great, 14 fumbles wasn't, and that's why he's on number 5. All right, we're at the top 4 of this list, and this is where these seasons stand out in greatness, in true greatness, and it differentiates them from the guys below them. The number 4 spot, I'm giving it to Chris Johnson. His 2009 season was crazy, and I grew up in Nashville. I got to watch this season. This is during the beginning of my love for football, and I've seen him play quite a few times. He ran for 2,006 yards, pretty low end of the 2,000 spectrum, 14 touchdowns on 5 yards an attempt. That's pretty average for this entire list. A very impressive part of him is he had 50 catches for 500 yards and 2 touchdowns. He had the most all-purpose yards of anybody on this list, 2,506 yards, and he had 16 touchdowns, both sides of the ball, passing and receiving. So, overall, he was big in the statistical category. Also, watching him play was a treat. He truly was the fastest guy on the field at any time. Chris was so good at just, hitting a couple jukes, and then he was gone. Nobody was going to catch him. Week 1 of that 2009 season, he started off with 15 carries for 57 yards. Pretty lackluster performance looking at, some of the other performances on this list. Then in week 2, he had one more carry. He had 16 carries, nothing. Oh, he had 197 yards and 2 touchdowns with 9 catches for 87 yards and a touchdown. Good God. One more carry than his previous game where he had 57 yards, and he has 197 yards. Whew, that is where Chris started to absolutely, catch up. He was getting the numbers. You watched his first game, and you thought, this 2,000 yards, there's no way in hell he's getting there, and he did it. I mean, his team went 0-6 to start the season, and other than that 197-yard game he had in week 2, he was okay. Then, in week 6, when the Titans lost 0-59 against the Patriots, the biggest blowout in NFL history, something snapped in CJ, and Vince Young came in and changed the momentum of this team. Chris didn't run for under 100 yards in the last 10 games of this season. Plus, the Titans went 8-2, so Chris's performance elevated his team to a winning record and overall gave them a winning persona, and Chris was the guy. He was helping his team. He was doing what Derrick Henry did. Without Chris, that offense doesn't work because you need those long, crazy touchdowns that he was getting every game to propel you forward into that territory of, winning and being a winning team and having a winning culture. I would put CJ a little higher, but he had a pretty average amount of touchdowns. Plus, this Titans team was bad, and he didn't perform too well for about 5 games this season. He wasn't breaking records, except for week 2 and then the last 10 games. 5 of those 16 games, he was not, the best player on the field. And overall, it hurt his team, it hurt their record, and it hurts his placement on the list. That's why he's ended up at 4. The number 3 spot, this is the biggest case of me using my knowledge of the game and watching this 2012 season. I remember this 2012 season from Adrian Peterson in its entirety. I remember how good Adrian was. He was on another level, and that's why he's 3. And that isn't the only reason, obviously. But man, watching him play, it was clear that he was the best player on the field every game. There wasn't an outlier. He was the best player every game. He was leading his team to wins. He didn't have any dud games. He was obliterating teams. He was averaging 131 yards per game. Absolutely killing it. He only ran for less than 150 yards 3 times on the entire season. 123 yards, 108 yards, and 86 yards. 3 games where he didn't crack 150 yards. That is dominance. That's insane. There's nothing I can say more than that. That is one of the most impressive stats on this entire list. And it's why he's 3. The dominance he had. He was either doing good or he was doing great. He was consistently leading the charge, and he dominated in the process. Every single down, he was going to get the ball. The defense knew that, and he still couldn't be stopped. AP did only have 12 touchdowns, which is a little bit of a knock to his performance. But from what I remember from this season, he deserves no less than the 3 spot, and that's why he's on this list. He won MVP in this season, and he ran for 2,097 yards, almost breaking that Eric Dickerson record. With just a few more yards, he could have got there. And man, was it a special season. All right. We're finally at the top 2, and this was the most difficult choice I made on this list. The number 2 best NFL rushing season ever in the 2,000-yard club is going to go to Terrell Davis. His 1998 campaign was spectacular, and for a very unique reason. Terrell Davis had an extremely weird career. He had an extremely short career as well, but overall, when you win back-to-back Super Bowls, and in one of those seasons you ran for 2,000 yards, man, you were important to your team. He won MVP in 1998, the season we're talking about now. And during the playoffs, he didn't run for less than 100 yards in any of the games. Plus, he had 103 yards in the Super Bowl, which they won. Doing a little bit of research also indicated to me that he was on a good team, This team was good, and he isn't to be attributed to all of these wins. Not really any. He probably helped them get there, and would they have won a Super Bowl without him? Possibly not. Probably not, honestly. But his team was really good, and they could have had a shot without him. But with that said, that means that in the second half of a good amount of games, Terrell Davis didn't play.
How many carries for TD in the first half? 168 yards. Not a bad afternoon, huh?
Some games we were up 40-6 at the half, and we didn't need TD anymore.
Starting the half off, we'll go with same offensive line, same receivers. We'll take TD out.
Huh? No, just don't take me out.
For the rest of the game?
Legitimately, he could have rushed for 2,500 yards that season.
Here goes Terrell Davis, big hole, TD, still on his feet, 30, 25, 20, 15, 10, 5, touchdown. You're out. You're out.
He didn't play, and when you hit that many yards and you have 21 touchdowns and you didn't play the second half of a good amount of games, good Lord, that is special. That is a special statistic to have, and it's why he's number 2 on this list. 21 touchdowns, which is by far the most on this list. 17 was the second most, and that was from Derrick Henry this year. But Terrell had an incredibly effective season getting the ball into the end zone. Plus, he had 25 catches, 217 yards in the air, and 2 touchdowns, which just brings his total up to 23 touchdowns on the season. The biggest issue, and the reason why he's number 2 on this list, even with winning the Super Bowl and the league MVP, and running for 2,008 yards with 23 total touchdowns, the reason he was number 2 is because he ran it for the 7th most times in a single season in NFL history. He had 392 carries. That is a crazy number. And when you're top 10 carries of all time, man, that's hard to overlook. And honestly, if he had even 370, if he had the second least under Jamal Lewis is 387, I still would have put him probably above the number 1 guy. But the 392, 7th most in NFL history, it's too many. It's too many times to run the ball. And, man, it hurts his placement on this list. A cool part of this story is that Davis was still 170 yards short of 2,000 yards in Week 17. He couldn't get there, and it didn't look like he was going to. He had a couple of cracked ribs. He was in pretty bad condition. But his team was motivated to get him to that 2,000 mark. He needed 170 yards to finish the season. On the last game of the season, they've already secured a playoff spot. They're one of the best teams in the NFL. They have no reason to play. But this team was going to get Terrell to 170 yards, and they made that clear. So, Terrell did it. He got to 2,008 yards, and they put him on the bench. To think that if they hadn't put him on the bench, during the season and had let him play throughout, he probably would have had the most rushes in NFL history. But he also probably would have had the most yards in NFL history to match it. All right, we're finally at the number 1 spot on this list. The number 1 best rushing season on this list, and in the 2,000-yard club. Things off the field aside, I'm going to give this to O.J. Simpson. And for just a couple minutes, let's pretend that O.J. Simpson is a model citizen and just a football player. Let's pretend. Take everything off the field out of your brain. Forget it happened. O.J. had an incredible season. In 14 games in 1973, that's how many games they played. He had 2,003 yards, on 332 rushes. Good Lord. That is 60 carries less than Terrell Davis. And he only had 5 yards less. That's dominance. He was dominating. He's leading his team to wins when he was playing well. The 6 worst games that OJ had that season were the 6 games they lost. His best games that season were the games they won. He was an important factor in winning. His team needed him. And watching him rush and play, there's plenty of film. I'm sure you're watching it as we speak. OJ was special. This season was special. If I were to take away 2 games from each player on this list, to where they only played 14 games each, only 2 others would still have hit the 2,000-yard mark. Eric Dickerson and Barry Sanders. I only took away those players' worst games. I gave them the benefit of the doubt. Who's to say maybe they had great games or horrible? They would have had horrible games and they would have been taken away, but they also could have had 180-yard games that were taken away if they didn't get that 16-game mark. OJ wasn't given that ability. He only had 14 games to get to 2,003 yards, and he did on 332 carries. If I were to add OJ's average yards per game to his total twice to get to 16 games, so just giving him his average for 2 games to then put him with those other guys that had 16 games, OJ would have had 2,300 yards, and that's the most in NFL history by 200. I say now that I don't think Eric Dickerson's record will be broken for 50 years. I think that record will stand for a long, long time. It still hasn't been broken, and it happened in 1984. It's 2020. No, I don't think it's going to be broken. OJ would have broken it by 200 yards. Oh my God. That's crazy if you just give him his average. Good Lord, was the guy good at running. OJ didn't add much in the air. He only tallied 6 receptions on the year. I mean, that definitely shows you that this is 1973. This is a long time ago, and this league was much more focused on running. He still only ran it for 332 rushes, the least on this entire list by far. And man, was he crazy good. The way he ran kind of reminds me of Dalvin Cook, but bigger. OJ had great size. He was 6'1", 210. He didn't lose much speed even with that size, kind of like Derrick Henry. He was faster than everybody out there, and his ability to move laterally was just a crazy important piece of his game. I mean, here's a photo of his game logs. You look, all those wins are this is all of his games ranked from his most yards to his least yards. So we had 250 win, 219 win, 200 win, 171 win, 166 win, 157 win, 137 win, 124 win, 123 win. Then starts to have a little bit less, and even then, 120 yards and a loss, still 120 yards. 103 yards and a loss. I mean, he's up there in the hundreds. He's up there in the hundreds in 1973. His team's losing these games, which is unfortunate. But you'll look at the top of this list, and you're reminded of how damn good he was at playing. I love the way he ran the ball. He did it at a very, very efficient rate. He ran 6 yards per attempt on 332 rushes, and he had 2,005 yards. Can't say it enough. I do think that O.J. Simpson had the best 2,000-yard season of all time. Thank you so much for watching if you got this far. This video was extremely difficult to make, and if you have a problem with my rankings, please tell me why. I'm curious to hear your thoughts, especially if maybe you're a little bit older and you got to see some of these seasons play out in their entirety. Thank you again so much for watching. I will catch you next time, and peace.